Hi, and welcome to the OrgDev podcast. What does good OD actually look like in action? How do I build my confidence in this field? And what does it take to lead change effectively? If you've ever asked yourself these questions, then this episode is for you. Starting a career in OD isn't like stepping into a traditional profession. There's no set path, no clear-cut job descriptions that tells you exactly what to do. Instead, you find your way, sometimes by accident, sometimes with intention, and learning through experience, reflection, and the challenges you take on. Some people come into OD from HR, from consulting or psychology, and others realize that they've just been doing OD work all along without ever knowing it. But no matter how you get there, the real question is, how do you develop the mindset and skills to thrive in OD? And that's exactly what we're exploring today with Regan Miller. She is the brilliant co-author of OD, the Accidental Practitioner, and her latest book, OD, the Intentional Practitioner. Her work dives into these different entry points into OD, the shifts that help practitioners grow, and what it really means to be intentional in shaping organizational change. Regan is an experienced OD and HR leader with a strong background in both public and private sectors. She's currently a team lead at the US Office of Personnel Management, where she focuses on organization design within HR solutions, helping public sector organizations and clients across America. Her fascinating career spans significant roles in workplace and succession planning, org design, developing performance cultures, and of course OD. And she's worked with a various number of federal agencies, including the Department of Homeland Security, Department of Commerce, and the Department of Labor as well. Of course, all of her brilliant practical experience is underpinned by organizational psychology as well. So we're so pleased to have you join us today. Danny and I have been devouring your book all week. Danny, can you please show the bacon bookmarks?
Yes.
I think that is a podcast record. We've absolutely loved reading your book. So welcome, and thank you so much for joining us.
So just to kick us off, just tell us a bit about the books. How did it come about? What was the kind of inspiration to start writing them?
Sure, yeah. So Larry and I, he started off as my mentor when I entered into this field. So I just kind of tagged along in a lot of fun ways with him. But we were talking to each other years ago. It was the last ODN conference in Vegas before COVID hit, and we didn't have those events for a few years. And we were sitting in all of these different sessions, and folks were standing up saying, hey, I'm here. I have a question about OD, and I don't know what it even is. I was just told to come here and learn about this. And it was time after time after time people introduced themselves that way. And Larry and I just looked at each other at breakfast and we said, something's happening here. What is this? And I said to him, did it ever occur to you that everyone in this field is an accidental practitioner? And he just kind of stopped and he said, yeah, I am. I said, yeah, me too. So everybody kind of comes into this from a side door more often than not, really. And he goes, well, we could write an article about this. I said, well, you probably have enough to write a book. And so here we are. We decided to write our first book during the first year of the pandemic. So why not add that to the mix of things? And when we finished Accidental Practitioner, we thought it's not quite done yet. There's more to this. How do you actually go from accidental to intentional? And we wanted to build on those concepts, which resulted in the second book we released last year.
Fabulous. So how do you define an accidental practitioner and then an intentional practitioner? What's the difference between the two?
Yeah, so accidental is really that person who's kind of coming into the light of understanding I'm doing something that actually has terms around it. It's a field. It exists. There's structure to this. I know I'm doing more than HR. I know I'm doing something other than just leadership development. It's that sort of sensation you're getting of this is something, and I'm latching onto it, and I want to understand more. And so you're probably more in that like ODN, I think, says for 7 years, you're an emerging practitioner. And I think that's where you go from accidental and into emerging. Once you start grasping the concepts around what OD is to you and how you want to practice it, and you're thinking about how to put this in place in organizations, whether you're internal or external, that's when you're starting to move towards intentional, really digging into those concepts around use of self and your judgments and your bias and the way in which you want to practice and engage in interventions in any organization that you're working with. So you're shaping yourself as a practitioner.
Yeah. And I think when I was reading, I think the first chapter you talk about the amount of time it takes to become an expert in a field, and it's kind of, you're in it for the long game, aren't you? It's not something you kind of just pick up and I've sorted it. I'm an expert now.
Yeah, you are. And it's, I mean, if you're not a lifelong learner in org development, you're going to end up on your heels at some point, right? You've got to maintain that curiosity. So I think when you're in org development and you realize I'm an accidental practitioner, sometimes you're 20 years into whatever career you chose or more, right? So then you go, oh, shoot, I'm a novice again, right? And that's either exciting or terrifying usually.
And do you think this something that draws people in to become accidental OD practitioners? What is it that they find they might be doing a different role and they're kind of drawn into OD without meaning to?
I think what's happened for me, and I know several others I work with, is you realize that maybe you're working in one specific area, right? Like maybe you're in leadership development or you're in human capital planning, and you just kind of realize it's just something's missing. You're not making the effective change and the long-term systemic change that you could if you look at more than just that one thing. And so I think part of it is this natural craving to go towards more impactful, more sustainable change. And some of it is also just realizing maybe I've mastered this part and I think there's something more to it. And so you start that broader exploration.
Yeah, so one of the things that really stood out for me when I read it, and it's just at the beginning of the book, and I think it will resonate with a lot of people. It's kind of about someone that's been asked and tasked to set up an OD function from scratch, and they're not quite sure what it is, and they go away to a conference to go and hang out and spend time with other OD people, but it actually just confuses them even more because it turns out no practitioners can agree with it. And to a certain extent, that's it happening a lot in the UK at the moment. There's a lot of HR or learning and development functions that are rebranding as OD and not necessarily being able to define what it is. Is that something that you noticed a lot in the field? And what have been some of the sort of the solutions that you've had to come up with to support people during that difficult process?
Yeah, I've definitely noticed it. This is something that Larry and I kind of philosophize on all the time. But we've noticed that because OD touches so many different areas of expertise in terms of especially people management, we're talking about behavior change, there's a lot of folks who feel that they're doing OD because they're doing a part of it. Well, I think in my organic world, if you're going to be doing OD, it's because you're affecting systems change. You're thinking about more than just one lever. You're thinking about 5 levers. You're working with multiple parts of an organization. It's much more in that system rooting. And that's where in the first book, Larry and I were talking about the future of OD and what is it. And we've talked about how it really needs to be elevated, because if we're just rebranding an HR function as OD, it's still going to be buried in part of an organization. You still might not be supporting the senior most executives who need to hear from you or the board, right? And you still create some barriers to practicing OD effectively if folks are reticent to talk to you or they don't know what's going to happen to your results. You don't have the ability to actually affect change. All of those things get factored in when you're talking about what is OD and where do we practice it in organizations.
Yeah, and one of your chapters is actually called Systems, isn't it? And that's one of the things that we really loved about it is, you talk about the importance of intervening at different levels and in different ways. Sometimes interventions can be just too narrow. To affect change, you have to really sort of embrace it and understand how the system works. And another thing you were saying in terms of understanding the logic around why decisions were made originally before you can then start to understand why change can be made. You can tell we've read the Red book, can't you?
Yeah, maybe more than I have. And it was so important for us to convey that, because that's where I think folks realize they're moving into org development, is when they start realizing they're thinking about the system. They're thinking about, if I change this, what happens over here? Or I want these behaviors to be different, but if I leave the performance system alone or the reward system alone or the hiring system alone, I might never get these behaviors, right? And I think therein lies another challenge with OD is I think the advent of dialogic OD is fantastic. I think that's a great tool in our field. And we actually had folks who we asked, for input on our books before they were published. And they said, oh, it's too diagnostic. We much more are in the dialogic camp and things like that. And I think there's room for both, because if you skip that root cause and you skip that deeper understanding, you just risk slapping a Band-Aid onto something that's really not correcting a systemic issue that's deeply rooted. So root cause analysis has a critical role. Can't get hung up in it forever, though. Got to have forward movement, too.
And I think for me, what's really powerful in your book is the lists of questions that you provide for practitioners to use, that kind of ask these questions, look at the problem or the situation through these lenses. And there's lots of that in the book, isn't there?
Yeah, there is. And that was really important for us to include because we didn't, you don't get skillful just from reading, right? You have to actually start applying. So we said, what are we doing writing a book about how to be skillful? Because you're not going to be skillful because you read it. So for us, that's why you see the whole chapter on case studies in the second book. And we've got cases sprinkled throughout in there, in addition to the first book, because those reinforce they're real life scenarios. They're things that either Larry or both of us have faced. And if you start asking yourself questions and training on these cases, then you're starting to think like a practitioner without having to stand in a room and worry about, oh, what if I ask the wrong question, or what if I say the wrong thing when I'm standing here?
But the questions you've put in there as well, what the audience hopefully can take away from it is that the questions do a lot of things. So the questions invite you to take different perspectives. It invites you to think about, is your solution in the short term, but what's the implication long term? And then you invite us to think about what are the other options that, what the upsides and downs. The questions are really good because they actually make you think about what's going to happen as a result of this, don't they?
Yes, it's hugely critical to step back as a practitioner because you're part of the intervention. As soon as you're in the room with whoever your client is, whether it's internal or external, you're shaping the future and you are creating change by your presence. So you have to demonstrate those thought processes that you want to embed further into your client situation as well, right? You don't want to have everyone dependent on you to think through those things. But if you can ask those questions yourself of the client, you're helping them get smart and you're helping yourself get smart to better facilitate change in the organization.
Regan, you are a practitioner in your own right, as well as an author. What was your journey into OD? Like, how did you find it, or did it find you?
Oh, that's a fair question. I think it was a little bit of both. I picked IO psychology as my master's program because I always had this fascination with how people and organizations work. There was always an importance to that to me. I mean, first off, I grew up swearing I was going to be a teacher. So there was always this humanistic interest, I think, in my world. But I realized I wanted to be in business. So that's where it started. And I had, of course, learned some of the basic concept of OD at that point. But over the course of my career, I just started saying yes to different things. When I was hired into government, I was working in more of a staffing office that was building out how do we consult in strategic human capital areas. And we started saying yes to, can you train folks on strategic interviewing? Can you go out and look at our workforce planning? Can you help us build a succession plan? And so I did those things. And then I switched more into a policy posture when I switched over to the DoD agencies and thinking about, okay, broadly, if we have this human capital policy, what does it do at the implementation level? And so as you start practicing those things like I did, and I kept moving through it, I ended up getting back to projects where clients were saying, we don't have enough people. Or something just isn't working, right? We have turnover. We have resource needs that we can't seem to meet through staffing or development. And how do I allocate my precious time and money to create an organization that's functional? And as I was doing those projects, of course, sure, we'll start with, I don't have enough people as the problem statement. But I could tell you need 50 people all day, every day. And that still doesn't solve your problems because you still don't have efficient processes. You're still not hiring the right skills. You still have upskilling needs. All of the things, right? So I just refused to take the singular lens on, okay, let's answer the first question that the client had and we'll just call it that, right? How easy that would be. So as I did that, we just kept getting bigger projects where at one point where I was introduced to Larry, we just had a senior executive who said, yes, I need to change the system, but I'm taking over this organization because it's got some systemic challenges with people management and our leadership skills. And that was my very first intro to formal org development as a practice. And I just latched on ever since. And it's been 9 years ago now.
And you're touching on something that a lot of OD practitioners come up against, which is they're brought in and the problem is kind of defined to them in a particular way. Often is event driven, or like it's just a very sort of a one-dimensional way of looking. How do you get people that maybe don't get challenged that often, and you're coming back and saying, well, actually, it's a bit more complicated and you might be actually part of the problem? Like, how do you go about doing that?
Yeah. Larry is famous for telling leaders, you're part of the problem, but you're also part of the solution. And I used to think, how does he get away with that? But it works. It works. It clicks with leaders
I'm going to
because
write that down.
they get to take some ownership. Yeah. Yeah. That's one of our, I think, just key wisdom bits to take forward. Look, nobody, for the most part, will call and say, I need org design or I need org development, right? They're not thinking in that broad perspective, because anyone who calls you as a leader has had time to observe their scenario and they're thinking of the solutions they know within their control, right? And so if they're calling for help with that solution, they've already identified something's going on. I think it's incumbent upon the practitioner to say, okay, we have a problem we're reacting to, but we need to flip this script and be a bit more proactive to say, yes, let's react to this. What else do we need to know? And what else do you, client, need to be smart about to make sure we're making all the decisions we need to have sustainable long-term change? And that means we have to focus on something much more broadly than just the question you called or the problem statement you shared with us.
And you touch on something in the book, which many large organizations are battle with, is the whole thing about fads. And you name some of them, which I think we're all quite familiar with. And you have to buy the book to understand the chapter. But you kind of name it. And that is a thing, isn't it? And employees that have been there some time will see fads come and go. And there's a lot of energy and political and social capital invested in them. And then they just don't work out. And you kind of sort of say that a lot of those kind of fads are raced around motivation. But the ones that really move the dial are the ones that actually get in and look at the processes. Can you just tell us a little bit more? Because that's something that felt quite important for you to put into the book.
Yeah, it's man, fads are great. They make you feel good. You go to a good training and you walk away and you're like, yeah, I'll never forget. I had a class on conflict resolutions that someone says, oh, the instructor goes, when you leave this class, don't go, I know how to have a difficult conversation with you, spouse. I had class today, right? Don't take it home and say to your spouse, we can have a difficult conversation. I know how to do it. And if you think about it, right, she's saying it in jest, but you don't do that in an organization either. You don't leave class and the next day go, I just learned how to have a difficult conversation with you, right? And so the challenge with the fad and the idea that I can go to a training or I can sit through a lecture or I can go to this energizing event and suddenly it translates to behavior change, that's really short-sighted, right? We have to have reinforcers. We have to have a system that supports the change. We have to say we're devoting the resources to that. This is more than just an event, right? That's the other differentiator for org development as a practitioner is you're looking at things much more broadly than I'm going to do a training, I'm going to do a workshop, I'm going to host this particular key event, and all of a sudden we're going to cure what ails us, right? So you can use those things that are seen as fads, as we cite them in the book, as a tool in a larger kit. But if you fail to use it as just a tool and reinforce how that actually can push you towards change in a future, then you just get a fad, and then it becomes flavor of the month. And then the next time you have your next training or fad, the whole room goes, here we go again.
Yeah. And again, another thing that we sort of see in organizations is that these initiatives, but just by the time they start to bear fruit, like the context has shifted and other priorities and the conditions that were in place when this was initially set up. So they move away from it and then they don't reap the benefits of it. Like what can practitioners do to keep their initiatives focused and centered and, the senior leaders still paying attention and resource on there as well?
Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest challenges. It's an excellent question because one of the biggest challenges is things will lose steam. If you're working with an organization and you're being told your project's putting on the back burner, it's likely never going to get picked up again. Or if it does, it's never going to look the same. So one of the biggest things we can do is early be proactive and engage the key leaders, key decision makers, and say, do we have at least 80% of you on board? Are you committed to at least devoting resources to this? The projects that I know I've had fail real quickly were ones where one executive called and had a vision for change and we're 2/3 through the project and they go, I got selected to go to this other role. So-and-so is going to take this over. And they say they're going to take the project over. And it's just key terms, right? It was a project. It was never a systemic change initiative. It was never we're trying to actually reshape the organization and how we behave. It was referred to as a project and it was X person's going to take it over, not this person buys into my vision and they're going to take it forward and they're ready to partner with you. None of that. So absolutely, you have to get much more engaged early to set the stage to say, I'm not the change agent organization and leaders, you are. And if you're not committed, this is high risk for failure.
The other thing I wanted to ask you about was you have a chapter around proactive and reactive organizations. And a lot of the OD practitioners we speak to find themselves in that kind of reactive space where they're just responding, and they find it really hard to get to a position where they're able to be proactive. What advice have you got for people who find themselves in that kind of responding reactive?
Well, get used to it. We get called when there's
No, but
problems.
that's really good advice, though, isn't it? Because I think sometimes it's just like, no, well, cure me. It's not, is it? It's
Yeah. I mean, people are more prone to want to go to a doctor when they don't feel well versus I feel great. I need that annual physical. It's great to have that relationship in case something goes wrong, right? So the big deal is that when you're faced with the fact that as a practitioner, you're called in a reactive situation, one, cultivate your optimism. If you don't believe change is possible and more broadly than what you have been faced with, then you're in the wrong profession because you have to believe that change is possible, even in the most difficult situations. But two, it's also about building that relationship with the client and saying, I'm happy to partner with you on this. I'm glad that you recognize there's a challenge, but let's talk more about what this could look like if we really think about the whole system and not just this immediate need. For example, you might get a lot of clients a call and say, I need leadership 360s. My leaders aren't effective and we need to see what everyone thinks of them. Okay, right? Problem, symptom, solution, need assessments. Okay, well, so if you get that call as a practitioner, because that's something you do, right? Then it's okay, well, let's talk more about this. What's going on that even said leadership's a problem? What do you know now? Where have you gotten your data from? Okay, if you had a future state that was ideal, what would that look like? Let's talk about that a little bit. Let's find the early delta. Okay, how many other people believe there's this problem? And just get really curious and start building that curiosity in the client as well. And think more deeply about what was just shared with you than just, oh, hey, I need leadership 360s. And once I have that information, we'll be better.
What do you love most about the work that you do, working in OD? What really gives you joy and excites you?
I love being in a room when the light bulb goes off. I love when you watch leaders believe that the change is possible, when you watch them click in and say, yeah, I have been part of this problem, but we're going to move this forward. So often organizations try change, right? They get the fads, they get the flavor of the month, and, you get a new leader and they're going to come in and change everything. And, we create this environment where, if we use the term right, change fatigue, and people just stop buying into it. All right, we'll just put energy toward this for now. But when you can create that energy behind, we control our destiny in this organization and we are actually shaping it and we're going to bring everybody into this process, and then they get some real energy behind it, there's nothing better because they're taking ownership of that organization and they're going to take it forward and they're going to make change in a way that is with positive intent, hopefully sustainable, and hopefully deeply rooted in what that organization values and their purpose is.
You touched on something there that you talk about in the book, actually, which is like good moments to create change. And one of the key moments that you sort of did, because there are sort of moments in time where it's easier to make change than others. And you talk about the fact when then a new leader begins, because there is a change in personality, there's a change in priorities, and that's the optimum moment for an OD practitioner to intervene. Is that advice can you give to sort of OD practitioners for moments like that to make sure they're ready when that happens?
Well, you've got to be ready for both the positive of that, right? And the unintended consequences of that, right? Because that didn't happen in a vacuum. So if you've got that change, you want to take advantage of it. You want to help that person get real clear on what's my intent? What do I want to do here? How do I want to engage the system that I have, that I've inherited? Also seeing kind of what their lens is, do they view themselves as having to be the change, right? Or do they want to pull in everybody? And really just inserting yourself as that thought partner that you can go through that real deep conversation about how do we make this meaningful? How do we take advantage of this opportunity to, if you're lucky enough to be engaging in it and coming in and leading a sustaining organization that's healthy, how do we keep those things going, right? Especially if they're inevitably going to want some changes, right? But also if they're inheriting and taking over an organization that's challenged, okay, well, what do you bring to this to make sure that we are working for a healthy organization and that you are leading that in a positive and just constructive way?
And then flipping the question, what do you find most challenging about the work that we do?
Oh, it can be exhausting, right? I said you got to cultivate that optimism, right? But there are some times where you're working with an organization and you might have people who are cynics about your whole effort and they are in a position where they can really subvert what you're trying to accomplish. And that can really drag you down. That can really, as a practitioner, it can feel defeating because it's like, come on, like, we're trying to do good. I'm here for good reasons. And that's where, one, it's helpful to have a community around yourself as a practitioner, bounce ideas with someone, just share, I'm really feeling dragged down by this. I'm trying to help and I feel like I can't help. Also, remember that's all part of the diagnostic. What you're feeling and sensing guaranteed is happening in the client system. And sometimes that's a precipitant for change, right? Sometimes if you're recognizing, especially that an individual is dragging the whole effort backwards, the conversation is, in order to change people, do we have to change people and make sure we have the right people in the room that want to lead this change forward?
And I think one of the other things you talk about in the book is kind of dealing with emotions first, being aware of the emotions going on and tackling that first before you kind of go to the logic and the rational solution.
Yeah. Emotions are a great data point, and you're going to have them long before you have a rational thought. My goodness, right? Like it's, and this is an activity Larry and I do with practitioners. We'll do it with clients, is just helping folks articulate what their emotion is, right? So often you say, how are you? Okay, I'm fine. It's, all good. Well, none of those are really emotions. And so as a practitioner, you have to get really in tune with what are terms that I use to describe my emotionality. And if I'm feeling it and I can name it, can I name it for what I'm seeing in the room? And can I ask these people in the room with me to name it? Because if you can't name the emotion, then we're missing a really critical data point that can be used for driving all sorts of conversations.
Emotions are kind of, we don't do that. And it's not for the workplace. We don't deal with emotions, but they're there, aren't they? Just
they are
unacknowledged. Yeah.
Yeah. We want to just put them aside. People get angry or people get frustrated or someone gets excited and everyone's like, why are you excited about this? That's a fad, right? But, excitement is saying, I'm interested, right? I'm optimistic. I want to engage in this. Anger and frustration, well, maybe we haven't found the root cause yet. And if we just say, hey, I'm hearing this anger, that's what it sounds like to me. Someone might sit back and go, well, I'm actually not angry. I'm just really passionate about this. Here's what's been nagging me, right? And you might actually get some more information if you just put a name to it and let someone then further articulate what they're thinking.
That's really interesting, isn't it? Because I think in my experience anyway, so at senior leadership level, a lot of senior leaders suppress their emotions. They may be feeling very emotional, so they may be feeling very anxious, and you can tell the behavioural tells, but they wouldn't necessarily name it. For practitioners watching this, how do you create the psychological safety where they feel okay to actually name their emotion? Because although it's perfectly healthy, they may feel making themselves a little bit vulnerable in front of their colleagues, for example, rather than sort of projecting this, I'm in control, this is all fine.
Yeah, well, if you're in control and it's all fine, why are you anxious, right?
That's a good question.
I think that's where practitioners who have some experience with coaching, it benefits them. I found that over the years that the training I continue to engage in executive coaching helps me navigate those situations, because you have to meet the executive where they are. But two, sometimes your job is to help name things as a practitioner. So if you're sensing that from a senior leader and you're in a room of senior leaders, there's nothing wrong with as who you are in your role saying, hey, I'm sensing a shift in the room. I'm feeling a tension. Is anyone else feeling that tension? And just you being the one to say, this is what I'm feeling. Are you feeling it? And making it safe to just, this exists. And then they can all correct me if I'm wrong. Say, nah, we're fine. Okay. But you have to keep creating those moments where it's okay to surface it. And sometimes the group you're working with will acknowledge it, and sometimes they won't. And if they won't, it's probably just a sign they're not ready. But you just keep gently nudging it over time. And again, that's where org development's not an event, it's a process, because that process can take, several iterations before folks are comfortable.
Yeah, and you touch on something, because that's that kind of the thing that you get with experience, isn't it? It's the, I'm going to make a very light intervention. You can act on this or not, but you don't have to respond perfectly to me now. You don't have to go, I'm having a cathartic moment because you asked the right question at the right time. You kind of sort of making and if they decide to act on it, that's okay. We'll move on. We'll try again in a different way. There's that kind of not feeling the need to be certain and be right at all times.
It's uncomfortable. It really is. Because, here's another difference with org development a practitioner in it versus a consultant, right? Consultants are called in to be an expert. They're called in to say, here's recommendations on how you solve your problems based on what we know. And if in my perception as what an org development practitioner is doing, you're not there to solve the problem. That has to emerge from the group that you're working with. Your job is to help facilitate the space and the conversations and the process to actually get to that result with the group who needs to own the result. So putting yourself in the position of saying, I'm not here to solve this for you, but I am here to create that safe space and give you the opportunity to do it in a way that maybe you haven't tried before. That's uncomfortable. That's, I think, when we talk about the difference between an accidental and intentional practitioner, when you're an intentional practitioner, that's going to feel much more natural than it does early in your career. Because I have to admit, that's probably one of the things that in the last 8 years, it's taken me a while to be okay with saying, I don't have the answer. What are we doing here? What do you want to talk about, group? It's your conversation. It's your agenda. I set up an agenda with you, but if that gets blown out of the water because this topic is the topic to talk about, are you willing and able to stay there? And is that what you want? And if the answer is yes to all those things, then okay, let's stay here. Let's have this conversation because it clearly matters to you.
And are there any emerging trends or topics in your field that you're being fascinated by? Now, we're not saying you should write a book about it, but if you do, that'd be great. Like, what is catching your attention?
Man, Larry and I talk about this. How many books do we have in us? I think there's a few things. I think one that we've been musing on is how can academia help create more skillful practitioners, right? I think there's still value in formal programs that study org development. I think there's a case for every MBA program should have an org development foundational course at minimum in it. I think there's space to talk about what this looks like so it's more rooted in how we think about business. And I also am really interested in the idea of more effectively and more intentionally merging org development and org design conceptually. I don't view them as necessarily separate. I practice both regularly in my work, and I think they are very effective when they're used together to help enact change.
So, yeah, and I guess one of the big things is that there is so much good research in academia, and yet it never makes its way over to sort of management practice or sometimes even OD practice as well. What are your sort of thoughts in terms of how OD practice can be more informed and more evidence-based in the way that they work?
Well, I think that goes back to the lifelong learning thing, right? I think there's great organizations, IODC, IOTA, ODN, the Org Design Forum, the European Org Design Forum, they all have great nexus for sharing journal articles, for having small consortiums, regular chats where people are talking about the theory. It's incumbent upon you, if you're going to practice this, to stay on top of things. But I think the other side of this is, I found it really entertaining. The Economist had an article not long ago about just how inaccessible the language in academic research has become. Like, people cannot read it and interpret it very well. And that's so unfortunate because it just diminishes the amount of people that are going to find it valuable. So I think for us, it's incumbent to look at this research and find ways to apply it. What does this look like if I'm practicing? How do I change the language about it to resonate with the client? And all of your clients are going to be different, but business speak has its own sort of linguistic tools to it. So taking what a CEO would say, what you hear them say about their business, and linking it back to what you've read in the articles is how you're going to make that connection and how to take research and apply it. I didn't realize I was interested and able in practicing process consulting, Shine's process consulting, until I read his book probably 3 years after training with Larry. And I was like, oh, it's okay. I've heard all this before. But I was hearing it in his terms, and it was just kind of putting it together. I think that's the other thing, right? You're gonna read something, you're gonna practice it, and you need to go back and read it later and reinforce kind of what that linkage looks like.
Yeah, I think that's really true. I think I go back and read books, and you just consume them in a really different way. The kind of the more experiences you've had. So yeah, with you on that. If you look back at your career so far, what are some of the biggest lessons you've learned that you'd share with others?
I would say one of them is just, it's uncomfortable. You have to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. You're going to have moments where you feel like you responded wrong. I did. And you're going to have moments where you feel like I could have done things differently and that project would have been more successful. right? And just honoring that, it's okay that that's going to happen. As we know from the research, right? 70% of parts of change efforts fail. That's the famous statistic. And it's just the reality. And it's not always, you don't have to own that as the practitioner. I think the other lesson over time has really been to continue to be curious and to continue to engage with so many people in the field, because for every practitioner, there's a way to practice OD. It's part of the magic of this field is we each are our own practitioner and we take our own lens on it and we work with our clients in our own way. And there's always something to learn when you're talking with the community. So go out and meet people, get a mentor, ask someone what they did with a client. Say, I've got a situation. Can I bounce it off of you? And just learn from doing, and don't be afraid to step out there, because sometimes I was afraid to step out and I was hesitant. And, Larry just kind of put his boot and said, off you go. You're going to facilitate this part of the session. And I went, okay, this is terrifying. Uh, but I did. And then the bonus to him being my mentor is then we would say, we'd go to a break, right? We'd go to lunch or whatever. And then we'd sit down and he'd say, okay, are you ready for some feedback? Then I'd get feedback. And it was always gentle and provided in a very kind way. And it was helpful and it was constructive. And then he would ask, what did you observe in the room? And then we talk about what we would see. So I was constantly getting that reinforcement from live practice. So I think biggest thing I would tell anyone is if you think you're doing it, you probably are, and just get out there and do it more.
You talk about facilitation in the book as well, and it's something that we really strongly believe that it's probably one of the most important skills to have in an organization for HR practitioners, but for leaders as well. Yeah. What is an optimal way for people to learn that skill? Is it a learning by doing approach? Like, what is a good way, particularly people that may find it a little bit intimidating and, not know how to start?
Yeah, that's, you kind of got to decide what you're comfortable with, right? But I learned on the job a lot just from just saying yes to go out and volunteer and sit with someone on a workshop, be a secondary person, just get out and start getting immersed in it, and then start feeling more comfortable. I can do that. That's an interesting activity. Take that forward. But I think there's some excellent programs out there for folks who want to learn facilitation. It's like ATD has programs. I think there's things through SHRM. I actually am currently participating in the course hosted by Voltage Control. And it's been just enriching to be in this environment with 20 other people who are in the facilitation space and practicing and learning and, just building our own mural boards. How do we want to facilitate events? And I think you got to kind of pick, but facilitation again is one of those. The only way you're going to get better about it is to do it and find opportunities to do it, whether it's in a professional space or volunteering or at your church or, whatever it is, get out there and do it.
Yeah. And like the question I want to ask is like, how do you invest in your own learning? So you're still going back to school now and doing more training on top of it. What else do you do to stay on top of it? Besides writing a book and everything else as well.
Podcasts. I do podcasts. I'm always reading. I have a stack of probably 8 books, quite frankly. I do like to participate in the conversations, like the Org Design Forum has coffee and convos once a month. So as long as I have capacity, I sit in those because it's great to interact. And even in my own organization, I established a monthly, what we call a tech talk. And we just get our team together because we're all in this space. And once a month, we have whatever topic we need to focus on for our team development. And it's a safe space for, that kind of questioning of what are we doing? What do I need to do? What's going on with our clients? And, it's immediately applicable because we're taking it back to the work and we're able to say, oh, maybe we need to research more or build a method or whatever it is, but gives us that sort of collective support. But that's the beauty of my role in that leadership space of I get to learn from 10 people that I get to work with also.
Fabulous. So obviously, we'd recommend highly both your books. Are there any other books that have kind of had a real impact on your practice? Books or podcasts or anything else that have had a real impact on your practice?
There's just stacks upon stacks. It depends on what you're, trying to accomplish, right? And the terrible thing is I am really horrendous at remembering like author names. I'll read a book and I'll just go, that was good. I like that. Like, for example, I'm thinking there's a book called The Systems Thinker, and that author is just out the door right now. But I think it's a fascinating book because to be a good practitioner, you need to be a systems thinker, to have a book that's just talking about that, right? I love the book Presence by Peter Senge. It's more philosophical about how are we present in the space in which we're working in. I think That's excellent. Richard Boyatzis has books about change and positive psychology that I think are fantastic. And that's where I think continuing my education and coaching has helped because I'm currently in positive psych and well-being class, and just taking those nuggets and putting them into the org development space is also helpful. There's so many books. I should.
And so little time.
It's so little time. I know. It's like I constantly, my little cart is just full, and I'm like, I'll get to it eventually.
Brilliant. And last question from us, like, what's one piece of advice you would want to give to someone who finds themselves as an accidental OD practitioner? How can they become more intentional in their work?
Well, the first step is to recognize what you are, right? So if you've said, hey, I'm an OD accidental practitioner and this is the space, you have to make a choice. It's a decision point. Do I want to be in this space or not? Some people, I think it's very good to say, this is not the space I want to play in. I much prefer doing my focused area. And that is a service to both yourself and any potential client. So I encourage folks to really think about if this is a field they want to pursue. If you decide you want to pursue it, build your community, get engaged with the professional groups that we have available, and get to know yourself. I think, our first book has a whole chapter on use of self. Dave Jameson's out there doing courses on this. And I think it's just critical that you're able to understand your biases, your judgments, your emotional reactions, your ways of thinking about things. What type of conflict do you dive into or avoid? All those things, because that's critical to how you're going to build your relationships in your client settings. The field has oodles of things written about models, methods, interventions, tools you can use to kind of make change effective in an organization. You can go get any number of change management certifications. They can all be of value and they're all accessible to you, but invest in yourself as a person and a practitioner, because if you know yourself, the technical things will fall into place as you continue to learn.
I have to ask you a question on this because I'm going to regret it afterwards, because you mentioned the word models and I picked this book up thinking, right, there's going to be a ton of models in here. And there's two. You took a very provocative stance on models. What drove that?
Well, go to any org development practitioner book of any kind and look at how many models are referenced in there. You don't need us to talk about models. That was not the intent of our books, because that exists. The research exists in other books. The models exist in other books. What we wanted to do and accomplish in these writings is challenge people to think about how it applies. Models are just a construct. It's a way in which we can think about something. One model works for you, makes no sense to someone else, and vice versa. So you want to have a sort of compendium of models that you think are comfortable for you to talk about and use and apply. Pick the one that resonates with your client, if you even need one, and build your own language around how you want to practice this so that you can show up authentically when you're doing it. You don't need our models to be an authentic practitioner.
Yeah, because sometimes that can be a trap that some practitioners fall into, is we get overly attached to our models, don't we? It's like it must be this particular way, but it's about what the client needs and meeting them where they are, aren't they? Some people aren't conceptual thinkers and don't necessarily see a model, and they just want to know what's the next step to better.
Yeah, it's just like saying I love when a job announcement will say you must have ProSci certification. No offense to ProSci at all, right? Certifications be great. You have something to work with. But is that the only one you're going to let me work with? Because what if that doesn't make sense to a client? There's Cotter, there's McKinsey 7S, there's, and. But, constraining ourselves to a particular way of doing any work is risky, because then we might not take the time to really get to know the client in the way they need to be known and heard in order to really feel confident they can make change.
And then just one last question for me, because you just mentioned it, which is about that whole journey of self-awareness. And sometimes that's an overlooked piece, but you can't overlook it. It's part of the process of becoming an OD practitioner, is that sort of self-awareness. And it is potentially quite an uncomfortable process, isn't it? Because it can be discombobulating. Like, you learn about yourself in different ways and how you respond and what drives your behavior. That's part of the ride, isn't it? Would you say, or are there shortcuts past that?
There's no shortcut. You got to put down the phone. You got to stop looking at your Netflix shows. You got to just relax, and you got to sit with yourself sometimes and be uncomfortable. If you're standing in a room facilitating and you get uncomfortable, you have to recognize why you're uncomfortable. Is it something someone said? Is it the tenor of the room? Is it something you said? Because you can't identify that, you're not going to facilitate your way out of it, right? So you've got to take time to understand yourself in order to be able to react around others in a way that's helpful and constructive.
Brilliant. Well, I was just going to say a huge thank you. Really enjoyed the process. We're so glad you agreed to come on because it gave us a brilliant excuse to read your books. They're really good. And we really want to make sure that we get them into the hands of people that are at different stages. So whether you're an accidental practitioner and you're just suddenly discovering, and a lot of the guests that we've had on have actually described themselves as accidental practitioners. Maybe they're doing HR business partnering in a certain way, but they're dissatisfied with how things are. So that's a great book. And the intentional one where you're trying to set a function up, and you don't want it to be L&D plus, you want it to be OD as well. How can people follow your work or keep up to date with your latest thinking, or even just access your books as well?
Yeah, books are available on all the major platforms. So wherever you'd like to order it from, they are there. No audio books because Larry and I just haven't recorded them. But yeah, widely available on regular websites like Amazon and Barnes & Noble. And then you can find both of us on LinkedIn. And then that's where we'll also post. So Larry and I like to host workshops here and there. You can find us at we'll be doing a workshop at the ISODC conference at Sacred Heart University in May. So we're going to get out there and we're going to do what we can to build these opportunities to be more skillful practitioners and work with all sorts of different folks in the field.
It's brilliant. Thank you. And Danny, what are you taking away from the conversation and the book?
So much. I think people are really going to enjoy this episode. I love what you said about organisation development being a process, not an event. So I think having that in mind will set people in really good stead. The importance of kind of looking at the system and not just kind of single parts of it, equally important. And the thing you said about leaders, having the confidence to say to leaders, you're part of the problem, but you're also part of the solution. So.
Yeah, you've taken some of mine there, actually. If I could add anything, it was, I think it's just reminding us the power of fads and what they do and how they galvanize us, and making sure that we take a critical eye on them, and making sure that if we're going to invest so much organizational capital in this, that we're really doing it in the right way for the right reasons with the right support. And I really love what you were saying in terms of how you sort of intervene in a room and say, like, without going straight for the jugular, like saying, I'm noticing there's a change in the mood in the room, for example, and finding ways for people to then sort of start to say, and for them to come from them so they feel a sense of ownership around it too. So I've loved it. It's been a brilliant conversation. It's been really, really good. We really recommend your book really strongly. Thank you so much for your time. And we'd love you to, when you think of your next book, if you can come back on, please, if that's okay.
I'd be happy to once we get that pen to paper, if you will.
We've got some ideas for you. Brilliant. Yeah. Thank you so much, Regan. It's been brilliant.
Thank you.